Morning Mist. A Nature's Fury and Delights novelette, written by Leanie Brown, narrated by Christopher, an authorised voice replica. Chapter 1. As she climbed the hill near her new home, Barton Cottage, Marianne Dashwood hummed the tune of the new piece of music she was currently learning while her fingers occasionally moved along an imaginary set of keys. She and her sisters and mother had only been at Barton Cottage a short time, and it was nothing like Norland, the estate on which Marianne had grown up. However, it did have some enchantments. Some of those enchantments were these hills and the meadow just at the top of this particular one, especially at this time of day when the morning's mist was just rising to make way for the day ahead. As she reached the top of the mound, she paused both her walking and humming, lifted her face to the sun, and pulled in a deep breath of fresh morning air that had yet to be used by many since most people would likely still be lying in bed or preparing for the day. There were servants, of course, who'd been up since before the first tantalizing fingers of sunshine had begun to stir and part the mist which hung over the hills and valleys surrounding Barton Cottage. However, there would be few servants wandering the fields as she was. They would be busy baking bread, tending children, seeing to the animals, and other such tasks as were expected of them. Theirs was a life of hard work, and the thought of such caused Marianne to sigh. How dreadful it must be to live such a life, where greeting the morning with exuberance would be impossible. At the melancholy thought of missing the delights of these hills and meadows, an idea sprang to Marianne's mind. She would gather some flowers and place them around the cottage. Surely that would give Walter and Mary a small portion of the wonder and beauty she experienced on these morning rambles. She was confident that there was nothing more refreshing in the entire world than a walk in the morning mist. Here, the visions she gathered from the stories and poems she read, as well as the songs she played, could run free, galloping up the hills, descending down the valleys, rising on wings into the air. A walk in the countryside at any time of day was delicious. However, in these early hours of the morning, when the dew still clung to the grass and flowers, and when the clouds, which had descended to touch the ground, bringing with them the dreams found upon one's bed, were beginning to rise and depart, a walk was more than delicious. It was magical. She almost expected to meet some gallant knight returning to his castle after successfully vanquishing his foe. She rubbed her hands up and down her arms. The air was cool, but the day had appeared too lovely to wear her brown pelisse. Brown could be such a dull colour, and today was not a dull day. And so she'd ventured out with only her shawl to ward off the mischievous little pixies who delighted in causing a lady's skin to bump and her muscles to shiver. Marianne could not help but smile at the idea of pixies being shooed away by the motion of her hands as she warmed her skin. The sound of a falcon's cry and the snort of a horse drew her from her reverie and urged her to discover their source. With any luck, it would be him. She'd come upon him, an intriguing stranger, yesterday morning, and she had watched him from a distance, advancing and retreating, parrying and lunging as he fought an imaginary foe. She had been mesmerized with the movement of his feet and the form of his arms. She imagined he was likely an excellent dancer since his steps were light, quick, and precise. His carriage was erect and noble, and his arms strong and steady. She had been transfixed where she stood, completely and utterly incapable of alerting him to her presence. And so she'd watched until he had sheathed his sword and turned to leave. Then she'd hurried away, fearful that he might discover she had been watching him. It was not polite for a young lady to stand and stare at anyone. Her sister Eleanor had reminded Marianne of that many times throughout her life. But how could one, as curious as she, refrain from occasionally watching something of interest, especially when that something was actually someone very reminiscent of a knight from days of old? Quietly, so as not to draw notice to herself, she took up the same vantage point as yesterday, near a tree at the edge of the meadow. A skittering of delight danced up her spine. It was him, and he was dressed exactly as he had been yesterday, with boots that shone in the sunlight, breeches which stretched smoothly across muscular thighs, and a shirt of billowy fine white lawn that was open at the neck. He wore no cravat, no waistcoat, no jacket, and no hat. Wisps of his light brown hair moved freely as the wind blew, and his complexion appeared to be browned by the sun, as if his hat were a thing he often forewent wearing. He did not appear to be classically handsome, but there was something about him, an aura which proclaimed him to be far more desirable than any classic dandy. In Marianne's opinion, he was simply magnificent. The falcon soared above him, dipping and circling, and then when the intriguing stranger whistled, the animal came to rest on his outstretched arm. Other than the customary chickens, pheasants, geese and ducks, Marianne had never seen a bird at such a close distance as he was to his falcon. She had definitely never held any of the fowl that she had seen. The sight of the falcon resting on his arm captured her imagination, and she longed to step out from the shadows of the trees and make her presence known, so that she could see the creature even more closely. However, she was reluctant to disturb the gentleman before her, as he spoke softly to the animal, while reaching into the bag which hung at his waist and drawing out some morsel of food which he presented to his bird. Marianne marvelled at how gentle both master and falcon now appeared when, just moments ago, both had looked wary and prepared to take on some foe, even if the enemy proved only to be a pheasant or a mouse. Marianne attempted to remain perfectly still as she waited and watched, while silently hoping he would send the bird flying once again before her position of covert observation was discovered. However, she was not successful, for as she shifted to make herself more comfortable leaning against the tree, the falcon noticed her and alerted his master to her presence with a loud cry and a slight flapping of his wings. "Good morning," the stranger said, turning towards her. Marianne pushed off the tree where she was leaning, stepped forward 2 paces and extended a greeting of her own. "I did not wish to disturb you or frighten your falcon," she explained. It was not a complete falsehood. She had not wished to disturb them. She also had not wished to be discovered, but that part did not need to be said. "Is it safe for me to approach?" "Yes, Lorcan is relatively gentle," he replied. "He is no lapdog, but he has been flying for Sir John and myself for several years." Marianne approached slowly for, though the stranger said the bird was gentle, it was still a bird of prey with sharp talons and only a partially tamed heart. "This is Sir John's bird." The eyes of the handsome gentleman before her lit with humour. "It was an entirely self-serving gift from me to him 3 years ago. I tired of only hunting with dogs." "Do you visit Barton Park often, then?" She hoped he did, for she would very much like to see him there. Sir John could be interesting, but he could also be a bore, and he and his mother-in-law, Mrs. Jennings, enjoyed teasing and gossip far more than Marianne could abide. And then there was Mrs. Sir John, Lady Middleton, who cared for little save her horribly spoiled children. If he were at Barton Park, then there would be a delightful reason to suffer the others. "Indeed, I do. Sir John is a friend of long standing, and do you visit there often?" "We've only just arrived at Barton Cottage. However, we do dine there as often as Sir John can convince my mother to do so. You must be the Colonel whom Sir John was telling us would be visiting." From Sir John's intelligence about his friend, Marianne had expected some old, balding, and somewhat portly fellow. She had not thought that any friend of Sir John's, let alone one who was retired, would be so dignified, yet with a deliciously tantalizing liveliness lying behind his reserved facade. There was more to the gentleman before her than what he presented. She could just feel it. "Colonel Christopher Brandon at your service," he said, with a gallant nod of his head. Marianne was certain that if he had not been holding a bird on his arm, his bow would have been executed with perfect grace. He just seemed the sort who would be a gentleman through and through. "And you must be one of the Miss Dashwoods about whom I've heard so much," he continued with a smile, as he prepared to send his falcon flying once again. "One more turn of the sky for my friend here, and then he must be returned to his home," he explained. "I am Marianne, the second eldest Dashwood," Marianne said as she tipped her head back and watched the bird rise into the air with great powerful flaps of his wings. As she shielded the sun from her eyes, Lorcan's wings held their position as he soared. "He's beautiful," Marianne murmured. "That he is," Colonel Brandon agreed. "There is something rather special about the mixture of power and grace." "Oh, indeed," Marianne cried. She had been thinking the very same words. "My heart leaps up when I behold a falcon in the sky," he began. Marianne smiled with delight. She enjoyed poetry nearly as much as she enjoyed music. "It is a rainbow, sir." "While a rainbow is delightful, I prefer the majesty of a falcon in flight," he answered before continuing the poem. "So was it when my life began, so is it now I am a man, so be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be, bound each to each by natural piety." A sigh escaped Marianne as she listened to the short poem. Colonel Brandon's voice was the sort that she preferred. It was neither too high nor too low in tone. She would willingly listen to him read or recite all day. There was a musical quality to his voice. "Do you sing?" she asked, as the excitement of the prospect of hearing him behind her, while she played, overtook her. "I have not in years," he whistled for his bird. Marianne's hand flew to her heart. "You have not sung in years. How do you manage it?" He cast a quick glance her direction and chuckled as he once again rewarded Lorcan for returning to his arm. "It was only trying at first," he assured her. "Thomas," he called to a groom who stood with the horse. Marianne had not noticed there was anyone else with them. But there was Thomas, whom she'd seen once when arriving in Sir John's carriage for dinner on one of the occasions when her mother had accepted an invitation. She nodded and murmured a greeting to him, then waited and watched as a hood was placed on the falcon and the majestic bird was placed in a box to be taken back to his home at Barton Park. Chapter 2. "May I join you on your walk, Miss Marianne?" the Colonel asked. "Oh, I'm not going any further. Mamma will be worried if I'm gone too long, and then she will send either Eleanor or Margaret to find me." It was too bad, really. She would like to spend more time with Colonel Brandon, but she did not want to risk having to share him with one of her sisters. "Then may I see you home?" he asked as he put on his jacket and fastened the buttons. It was a delightful suggestion that drew a pleased smile from Marianne. "That would be lovely, Colonel, but first I must gather some flowers." Her eyes followed his fingers as he straightened his collar and pulled it closed to be held there by his jacket. It seemed a heavy coat for the warmth of the day. "I do not mind. In fact, if you require assistance, I'm capable of picking flowers and transporting them without damage." He was teasing, she could see it in his eyes. "I would not expect you to be incapable. I only worry that it will be too delicate a task for one such as yourself, who is used to falcons and such." Her replying tease found its mark, and he chuckled. "I assure you that such tasks are not beneath me, though I must shock you once again by admitting to not having gathered flowers for longer than I have foregone singing." Marianne looked up from where she had stooped to pick some flowers. "No singing and no flowers. I'm certain you have been living in misery." He shook his head, though unconvincingly. "I would not say misery," was all he said. She stood and handed him the flower she had just picked. "This one is for you." She wished to know what he would call it if it was not misery, for both his eyes and his tone had spoken of deep sadness as he said the words. However, she knew that it was not polite to pry into business that did not concern her, though not prying was not easily done. A great deal of fortitude was required for such a thing, since she was such a curious creature. "If I accept this flower, will you be expecting a song in return?" "Not just yet," she replied, before returning to her work of gathering flowers. "Perhaps in a week," he chuckled again. "If there is a song you enjoy, and I know it, I would be happy to play while you sang." She looked up from the flowers at him again. She was not certain if she enjoyed admiring his noble features from this aspect or when she was standing better. She supposed it did not matter as long as she was able to admire them. "I could even sing with you if the tune is so familiar that my fingers do not require all my attention." "I'm not even certain I can sing any longer." Not able to sing. The thought was both shocking and grievous. Surely anyone who could sing at one time could still sing many years after stopping, could they not? The meadow would not tell if you were to attempt the activity and failed. She rose from her place with half a bouquet of flowers, nor would I. His replying smile was slightly sad. "I once knew a lady a lot like you, when I was a young man." She tipped her head and studied his face. A broken heart could steal the desire to sing or even hear music from anyone, herself included. And she loved music. Therefore, she determined that must be the source of his pain. Was she pretty? Oh, she knew Eleanor would scold for asking such a thing, but a tragic tale of love and loss was one of her favourite sorts to read. A small fluttering of trepidation in her stomach told her that hearing a real story of such agony would likely not be so pleasant as reading one. She was. Her hair was just a shade darker than yours, and she was your height. Her eyes were a colour very much like the leaf of this flower, and her smile was the most welcoming I have ever seen until today. I had not thought another such smile existed. I am pleased to know I am wrong. Marianne could feel her cheeks warm at the compliment, and had she been alone she would have buried her nose in the small bouquet she held, while allowing herself to smile broadly, and revel in the knowledge that he found her smile welcoming. However, she was not alone, so she contained her pleasure in a small smile and said, "She sounds lovely." He nodded. She was. Did she sing? Perhaps he no longer sang because doing so reminded him of singing with her. No, he replied with a small burst of laughter. She claimed she would frighten the birds with her croaking, but I dare say she exaggerated. She hummed very well, and she liked listening to me sing to her. He twirled the flower he held. She also liked flowers. He had sung to her. Marianne's heart sighed at the wonderfulness of the thought of having a gentleman sing to her. If he were to stop, she would likely always find very little pleasure in music. She placed another flower into her bouquet. And she is why you no longer sing or gather flowers? A great laboured breath was answer enough for Marianne. This girl, whoever she was, had broken the Colonel's heart. That fluttering in her stomach had been correct. Hearing a true tale of lost love was not so delightful as reading one. The sorrow it stirred in her was different. It was not created by fanciful images, but rather from the sigh of a wounded man. Such sorrow was the sort that passed from his soul to hers, begging her to find some remedy for it, and creating an uneasiness which she knew would last until she had helped him in some way, though she did not know how she could. He shook his head. I cannot tell you about it. I will not ask, she assured him, as she stood from where she was collecting the final flowers needed to make an acceptably cheerful bouquet for the sitting room. Time does not heal all wounds, he added. Marianne's eyes grew wide. It does not. She was sure she had never heard such a thing before. He shook his head again. It has been years, many years, since we were parted. Not knowing what to say to such a revelation, Marianne opted instead to place a hand on his arm and smile softly, attempting to convey to him some of the sorrow she felt on his behalf. Sir John calls me a silly old fool for not having sought anyone since, and Mrs. Jennings is bent on seeing my sorry, lonely state fixed. Beware of her. She will have you married off before you know it. He extended his arm to her, and she will have no trouble finding you a suitor, for you are young, beautiful, and lively, quite the opposite of me. He chuckled. Strangely, it pricked her heart that he would speak of her finding a suitor. Do not fear, she said. Mrs. Jennings and Sir John have already been attempting to match my sisters and me with gentlemen they know. I have heard little else save how this gentleman or that one would be a good match, she laughed with him. You have even been promoted to my sister Eleanor. Oh, the idea of such a thing as Eleanor and the Colonel making a match caused that strange pricking again, which in turn caused her to pause for a moment before continuing. But having met you, I can see you would not suit. Eleanor is too grave. It is not because I'm an old curmudgeon. Marianne shook her head. An old curmudgeon? I think not. I'm certain an old curmudgeon would not own a falcon. Or look so dashing while slashing the air with a sword, she added to herself. You are too kind, Miss Marianne. I am ancient compared to you. Twice your age, I would venture. Are you 34? Not quite, but in 3 months' time I will be. And I will be 18 by then, so you will still not be twice my age. Why it seemed necessary to dissuade the Colonel of the belief that he was too old to be considered by one such as she was baffling and astounding. She had always imagined that a gentleman of more than 30 could in no way be appealing, but she had to admit she was as wrong as she was astounded. Why, there are far older men who are curmudgeons in every sense of the word who are married to ladies not much older than I. She shook her head. It is not your age that prevents me from promoting my sister to you. It is simply that she's far too grave. She's more of a curmudgeon at 19 than you will likely ever be. She looked up at him with wide eyes. Do not tell her I said that. I should hate to cause her pain or bear yet another one of her lectures. I shall not say a word. I am flattered that you do not find me too old, but I warn you that very like many old curmudgeons, I have a bit of a pain in one leg that afflicts me when the weather is unpleasant. Indeed? Is there a cause? He shrugged. It is likely due to a wound I received. A wound? She cried. Then it is perfectly forgivable. It was only a small skirmish, he hastened to add, seemingly uncomfortable that she should exclaim over his injury. I assure you it was nothing heroic. However, during that fight I was forcefully removed from my horse, and the lower portion of my leg broke. It has hurt on occasion ever since, but I find it has grown worse in recent years. They had reached the gate in front of Barton Cottage. You're still not an old curmudgeon, Marianne protested. Will you come in? While she still had no desire to share his attention with either of her sisters or her mother, she also did not wish for him to leave her. It is too early, he replied. However, I would not be opposed to calling at some more appropriate time if I am welcome. I would like that very much. Her heart actually leapt at the thought of a gentleman as dashing as Colonel Brandon, reclining in one of the chairs in their sitting room, and I am certain my mother will be equally as pleased. He held the gate open for her, as will Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, no doubt. She giggled at the comment, even though it strangely pleased her that she would be pleasing Sir John and Mrs. Jennings in such a fashion. Will you call today? I cannot today. I am previously engaged. Sir John and I are taking the dogs out for a run. Disappointment of a larger-than-expected size settled into her heart. Tomorrow, then? He closed the gate and she turned to go to the house, but then turned back. Will you be in the meadow tomorrow? She held up her bouquet. I may need more flowers. He grinned. Lorcan will be at home tomorrow, but I intend to visit the meadow. Then perhaps you can help me bring my flowers home when I've finished collecting them? I would be pleased to be of service to you in such a fashion. He tipped his hat and mounted his horse. Marianne sighed as she watched him ride away. Today was going to be interminably long. Chapter 3. What are you reading, Mamma? Marianne placed her bonnet on the work table and draped her wrap on the back of one of the chairs that stood at the table. Sir John has sent another invitation to dine with him. Mrs. Dashwood sighed and laid the folded missive in her lap. His generosity is commendable, but this will make 3 invitations just this week. Marianne sat down next to her mother with a stack of music to sort through. There had to be one song in this pile which would be familiar to Colonel Brandon. You will accept, will you not? It would make this day far less painfully long if Marianne could be assured of seeing the Colonel at Barton Park instead of waiting until tomorrow morning. You wish me to accept? Mrs. Dashwood asked in surprise. Marianne could not fault her mother's shocked reaction, for had Marianne not met Colonel Brandon, she would have been begging her mother not to force her into company with Sir John and Mrs. Jennings. However, tolerating Sir John and his mother-in-law was a small price to pay in return for a few hours spent with the Colonel. I do, she answered. Who is at the gate with you? Marianne's younger sister Margaret asked as she joined them in the sitting room, followed by their eldest sister Eleanor. There was someone at the gate. Mrs. Dashwood looked at Marianne with a great deal of curiosity. His name is Colonel Brandon. Sir John's friend? Eleanor asked. Marianne nodded and continued sorting through the music on her lap. The very one, but he's not at all as I expected. She pulled a short song from the sheets in her pile. This one would do. He would almost surely know this one. And you wish to dine with him so that Mrs. Jennings might push us together? Eleanor's tone was almost as sharp as the look she gave her sister. No, Marianne said with great feeling. I've already warned him that you would not suit. You did what? Mrs. Dashwood exclaimed before Eleanor could. A gentleman shows up at our gate and you tell him that your sister and he will not suit. Marianne rose and crossed to her piano. Oh no, he did not just appear at our gate. I met him in the meadow just over the hill. He was flying his falcon and I stopped to watch. Have you ever seen such a bird up close, Mother? I assure you it is an awe-inspiring proposition. Their talons are excessively frightening. Did you pet the falcon? Margaret asked. I did not dare, Marianne replied. His name is Lorcan. That is a lovely name for a bird, Margaret said. It is it not? Marianne agreed. The Colonel had exceptional taste. Likely in all things. How could he not? If he could name a bird so well. Liked music and recited poetry. About Colonel Brandon, their mother prompted when Marianne did not continue speaking. How did he come to be at our gate? Marianne lifted her eyes from the sheet of music on her lap. She would have to imagine how the Colonel might sound singing this piece later, when there were not so many inquisitive people around to interrupt her musings. He offered to see me home and was patient enough to wait while I gathered flowers. He really is so much different from what I expected. How do you mean? Eleanor asked. Is he handsome? Mrs. Dashwood asked on top of Eleanor's question. He cannot be. Margaret dropped her pencil on the picture she was sketching at the work table and looked at her mother in shock. Sir John said he was 35, and I'm certain no one is handsome when they are so old. I am older than 35, Mrs. Dashwood said with a pointed look for her youngest daughter. Are you saying that I am not handsome? Margaret laughed. You are our mother, and therefore you shall always be handsome to us even when you are quite ancient. Whether I am your mother or not, I cannot say that my looks have been completely spent. I admit my bloom faded some years ago, but I have not faded completely." "Oh, Mamma," Marianne cried, "you're as handsome as you ever were. Margaret is wrong." She felt a pang of self-reproof as she declared her sister's thinking to be incorrect, for she herself had assumed as much until this morning. She would have to be less judgmental of such things in the future. "I am? I think not. Sir John is at least 40, and he is not a whit handsome," Margaret protested. "I am sure he is handsome enough for Lady Middleton," Eleanor chided. "It is not nice to speak so of anyone, least of all Mamma's cousin, who has been so gracious to us." Margaret folded her arms and scowled at Eleanor. Marianne could sympathise with such an expression. Eleanor had no sense of passion. To her, one simply did what was right, regardless of how one might feel about something. "Colonel Brandon is handsome," Marianne said, "and he is not 35. He will only be 34 on his next birthday." "Is that why he is not as you imagined?" Eleanor asked. "Because he is handsome?" Marianne nodded. "Partly, yes. I was as mistaken as Margaret until I met Colonel Brandon. There is something rather fascinating about him. He has an excellent build, tall and strong. His jaw is firm and his eyes expressive." "And his hair?" Margaret asked eagerly. "Is it grey?" "Not a strand. It is perfectly brown," Marianne answered. "And why would he and Eleanor not suit? He sounds like a fine match if he's both handsome and fascinating," Mrs. Dashwood asked. "Eleanor is too serious. A gentleman such as Colonel Brandon does not need a serious wife. He has enough cares to cause melancholy without a wife to add to it." "I do not cause melancholy," Eleanor retorted. "You do sometimes," Margaret mumbled. "Margaret, that is far too impertinent," Mrs. Dashwood scolded. "I'm only saying that Eleanor's personality would not mesh with his," Marianne continued above the ensuing din before it could begin. "I believe he has a very sensitive soul, and Eleanor struggles to understand such." "I'm not beyond understanding," Eleanor cried. "Oh, not on most things. But you do struggle to accept those who are different from you," Marianne continued. "How often do you feel utterly at a loss as to how best to help me? I know it is true. I have heard you sigh. You long to be useful, and yet, in those moments you know not how, and it cuts your heart, for you're a very good and loving sister. I could not see you condemned to such sorrow for all your life, just so that you could marry a gentleman as handsome as Colonel Brandon. I'm certain I would perish from the guilt of having caused you unhappiness if I were to promote such a match and be successful. Therefore, I could not in good conscience do anything else, but inform him that Mrs. Jennings is incorrect. You and he would not suit." There was a lot of truth in her argument, but she knew that the reasons she stated were not her only reasons. There was another reason she wished for Colonel Brandon to not consider Eleanor, although she could not quite put her finger on what it was. However, whether she could name it or not, she knew there was at least one more reason why she absolutely could not promote a match between the Colonel and Eleanor. "And you think you would suit him better?" Eleanor asked. Marianne gasped. That was it. That was the other reason. She wanted Colonel Brandon to consider her. It all made perfect sense now. The pricking of her heart, her desire to prove him wrong in his thinking that he was too old for her. The disappointment that had settled on her when he spoke of seeing her matched with another. They were, of course, all signs that her heart had chosen him and needed him to choose her in return. She looked up from the music that was spread across the top of her instrument. "Do you think I would?" she asked. "He's old," Margaret answered. "He'll be gouty and die within 10 years. "Margaret!" her mother scolded. "It is what happens to old men," Margaret reasoned. "It does not," Eleanor chided. "He does have a pain in his leg," Marianne said, "but it is from an injury sustained in battle, so it must be forgiven and not credited to his age." "He was injured in battle?" There was a reverence to Margaret's tone. Marianne nodded. "He was knocked off his horse and his leg was broken." Margaret sighed. "We must meet him, Mamma." "You're not to ask him about his injuries," her mother cautioned. "Oh, I promise I will not," Margaret said. "Please, might we meet him?" Her mother smiled and shook her head. "I suppose there is no other way to determine if he and Marianne would suit." Margaret clapped her hands and scooted over to the piano just as Marianne began to play. "If you marry him," Margaret whispered, "may I then ask him about his injuries?" "Margaret!" Marianne chided in a stern whisper, but then added with a small smile, "so long as Eleanor and Mamma do not hear you." Chapter 4. Later that day, As the sun passed its height and began its descent, and after Marianne had completed many of her tasks for the day, she and Margaret slipped out the back door of Barton Cottage, intent upon finding a short moment of refreshment that could only be truly found in a walk. "Do you think we will meet Colonel Brandon?" Margaret asked. "I should think not," Marianne replied, though she secretly hoped they might. She had thought of little else all day other than if Colonel Brandon would like the music she played, if he had read the book she was reading, if the picture she was painting would be to his taste, if he preferred large gardens or small, and how he would look sitting near the window in the sitting room with a cup of tea in his hand and a charming pensive look on his face. It seemed as if he'd filled every corner of her mind. "Well, I hope we do." The words were tossed over Margaret's shoulder as she skipped ahead. Stopping, she turned back toward Marianne. "Do you think it will rain? The clouds are very heavy." Marianne knew that being caught in the rain, something both Eleanor and Mamma cautioned them against, was a favourite thing for her daring younger sister. "If we are, we mustn't get too wet, or Eleanor will scold." Margaret's nose wrinkled as her lips pursed. "And Mamma will make us drink that horrid tea." "We will stand under a tree if needed." Marianne had no desire to drink Mamma's horrid tea or catch a chill, since the first was unpleasant, and the second would mean not being able to leave her room and missing many chances to see Colonel Brandon. It would be lovely to have him call and inquire after her health, of course, but to have to lie in bed while knowing he was entertaining Eleanor was not something she wished to have to endure. As those heavy clouds would have it, Marianne and Margaret did indeed find themselves standing under a large tree as sheets of rain fell on the ground around the tree's dense canopy, with very few drops making their way through the leaves near the trunk where they stood. "Blast!" A gentleman slipped as he descended the hill in front of where they stood. "Are you well?" Marianne called. She hoped he was, because she did not relish the idea of having to leave her place and venture into the downpour to help him. "Yes," he called back, as he picked himself up off the ground and continued running toward them. "Only my pride is damaged," he added as he joined them under the tree. "Do you have room for one more in your leafy fortress?" Margaret giggled and assured him that they did. "Mr. John Willoughby at your service," he said with a bow, before taking up a position next to the tree's trunk. "And who might I have the pleasure of meeting?" "I'm Miss Marianne Dashwood, and this is my sister, Miss Margaret Dashwood." "Dashwood, you say? I had heard there was a new family at Barton Cottage named Dashwood, a lady and her 3 beautiful daughters, as it was told to me. You obviously must be 2 of those beauties, for even the greyness of the day seems lessened in your presence." They were very pretty words, and Marianne could not help but feel them profoundly. A lady always enjoyed being told she was beautiful. "We just arrived at Barton Cottage," Margaret assured their companion. "It is much smaller than Norland, which is where we used to live, but it has Mamma, so it is perfect, really." Perfect was not precisely the word Marianne would use for Barton Cottage. However, she could agree with Margaret that it was small and made that much more bearable because their mother was there. Still, she missed Norland and its large bright rooms and fine fittings. However, she did not miss her brother's wife, who had become the mistress of Norland in their mother's place after their father had died, and the absence of Fanny Dashwood was the one thing that made Barton Cottage preferable to Norland. No, that was no longer true, she thought with a smile. There was now also Colonel Brandon. His presence in the area made Barton Cottage quite desirable as a place to live. "You are the second gentleman I've met today when wandering these hills," Marianne said to Willoughby. "I shall have to make it a habit to walk here often so that I might make more friends. You're from the area, are you not, Mr. Willoughby?" Willoughby chuckled. "Indeed I am. My aunt has an estate not far from here. It will be mine eventually." He turned to rest just his shoulder against the tree as he spoke to her. "Besides myself, who might you have been fortunate enough to stumble upon today?" "Colonel Brandon," Margaret answered. "Although I did not meet him, I've only met you. But Marianne met him and told me about him, so I'm eager to make his acquaintance." "Brandon is at Barton Park?" Their companion seemed to shift uneasily. "I had not heard he had arrived." "I think he has only just arrived," Marianne said. "I wonder how long he will stay," Willoughby mumbled. "He did not say," Marianne answered, even though she was certain he was not asking to get a reply, but rather just thinking aloud. "However, I can ask him tonight when we dine with Sir John." Oh, look," Margaret cried. "We should walk in the rain more often, Marianne. Look, it is Sir John and someone is with him. Is it the Colonel?" "Well, speak of the devil," Willoughby muttered. Yes, Marianne answered her sister with a curious look at Willoughby. That is Colonel Brandon. A right old bore if ever there was one, Willoughby said, but a pleasant enough fellow. A bore? Marianne said in surprise. I did not think such about him when we met. She had not found one thing about the Colonel that seemed boring. Willoughby shrugged. It happens as one grows older, they say. He lowered his voice. He has a child. He does not, Marianne cried. Oh, he does, although he does not claim her as his child, but rather his ward. I met her this past season in Bath. That is how I know the Colonel to be a bore. It is through her account. He was dead set against her travelling to Bath for some time. She had to work on him most diligently to be allowed to go. He'd rather she stayed home and did her studies and nothing else, for he wishes for her to be a governess or to find a position at a school. He does not want her to marry? Margaret asked in surprise. He's not married himself. I doubt he places much value in the institution, but seeing as he will not claim her as his, she has very little standing, you know. He will, of course, have some coin set aside for her, but she said he had no desire to promote her to society. How dreadful, Margaret cried. How old is she? 16, perhaps, Willoughby replied. That is almost how old Marianne is. Margaret! Marianne chided. She did not like what Mr. Willoughby was saying and was feeling very much like Eleanor at the moment, which made it impossible for her to approve of Margaret's entering into gossip so readily. Colonel Brandon was not a dishonourable bore. He could not be. Could he be? Miss Marianne, Miss Margaret, Sir John greeted them in his normal jovial fashion. I see you have also been caught out in this weather as we have. Willoughby. He gave a nod of greeting to their companion. Have you met Colonel Brandon? I have, Marianne said with a smile for the Colonel. Just this morning, but Margaret has not. You know Willoughby, Sir John said to Colonel Brandon, and apparently Miss Marianne, though you had not told me you met her. There was that teasing wink Sir John favoured. This time, however, Marianne did not mind having it directed at her. Allow me to introduce you to her sister, Miss Margaret, Sir John continued. With any luck you will meet their mother and sister this evening. Oh, indeed you will, Margaret cried. Mamma sent back an acceptance of your invitation, Sir John. Capital news! I shall look forward to seeing it when I return home. He turned toward Willoughby. I see by your empty hands you have been as successful as we have been. But then we were doing more talking than is advisable when stalking prey, were we not, Brandon? We were, the Colonel answered, and yet you did not mention meeting Miss Marianne. I had not had the opportunity to do so. It did not seem like the thing to just toss into a conversation about hunting and dogs. Marianne enjoyed the serious look on the Colonel's face, coupled with the twinkle of amusement in his eyes. If one were to study him, one would likely find much that was interesting. However, if not observing carefully, one would only hear his tone and see his set expression and miss the hidden nuances. No matter what Mr. Willoughby or some supposed daughter of the Colonel's said, Colonel Brandon was not a bore. Not to her. But then, she was more curious than most. The rain is thankfully slowing, Sir John continued. It was quite the deluge there for a few minutes. If we were not so very wet, I would offer to see you and Miss Margaret home. I do not mind a little rain, Marianne replied. If Sir John and Colonel Brandon did not see them home, then Mr. Willoughby would think it was his duty, and frankly, anyone who thought Colonel Brandon was a bore was not someone with whom Marianne wished to spend a great deal of time. But I am equally as confident that we can find our way home on our own. Can we not, Margaret? Margaret's brow furrowed, and Marianne gave her a pleading look. Of course we are not lost. Margaret's expression softened as Marianne smiled at her in relief. If you do not mind a bit of rain, the Colonel offered, I have not forgotten the way to Barton Cottage and would be pleased to make certain you arrive there in safety. However, I will not be able to stay. We have a dinner for which to prepare, and we have the dogs. Then we would be happy for the assistance, Marianne replied quickly. We could make it a merry party, Willoughby added. Was he insisting on joining them? The thought annoyed Marianne. I see no reason to delay you from your purpose, Mr. Willoughby. It is not a delay. The rain has put an end to any purpose I might have had. Marianne pulled her lips into what she hoped was a bright smile. Then shall we be on our way? Thankfully, the Colonel offered her his arm, leaving Sir John with the dogs, and Willoughby to display his gallantry for Margaret. When they reached Barton Cottage, Sir John ducked inside to assure Mrs. Dashwood that he was delighted to hear she would be joining him for dinner at Barton Park. He would send his carriage to collect them at 4:30. Mr. Willoughby and the Colonel were spoken of and made known to Mrs. Dashwood. Then Sir John took his leave, and Marianne and Margaret were shuffled off to be warmed, dried, and put into proper clothes for dining. Chapter 5. Marianne sighed with delight as she savoured a bite of chocolate tart. The meal tonight at Barton Park had been exceptional. The items offered were exactly the same, with a few variances as what had been offered last week, but tonight they were enjoyed in the presence of Colonel Brandon. It was not only the food that was more delicious due to the Colonel's presence. Marianne was certain Sir John had spoken of hunting just as much last week as this, but he had done so with only himself to be interested. Today the Colonel's input made the discussion much more enjoyable. "Mr. Willoughby is a fine-looking young man," Mrs. Jennings said with a pointed look at Marianne. "His inheritance is good." "If he has any left when he receives it," muttered the Colonel, who was seated just across from her and down one chair. "What is that you said, Colonel?" Mrs. Jennings asked. "I believe he questions the man's ability to keep his finances in order," said Sir John. "Forgive me," the Colonel said, looking rather uneasy. "You know I do not like to tell tales." "But if you've started one," Mrs. Jennings said with an eager smile, "then you must finish, or I will have to concoct my own version." Marianne watched with interest as the Colonel gave Mrs. Jennings a tight smile and took a sip of his wine before replying. He was, no doubt, calculating his words before he spoke. She smiled behind her glass. That was very clever of him to do it in such a fashion that it seemed like a natural pause. "I have heard he enjoys the finer things in life, as many young gentlemen with no occupation do." "Indeed?" Mrs. Jennings' brows rose. "He does wear a suit of clothes well. Would you not agree, Miss Marianne?" Marianne nearly choked on her wine. "I had not considered it." She cast a worried look in the Colonel's direction. It would not do for him to think she found Mr. Willoughby to be a person of interest. She'd still not finished convincing Colonel Brandon that she should be a person of interest to him. Indeed, she had only just realised she should persuade him of such, and to have him thinking she fancied some other gentleman would be a setback before she even began on her task in earnest. "Oh, come, Miss Marianne, every young lady notices the cut of a gentleman's coat," Mrs. Jennings insisted. "His coat was very fine," Margaret supplied. "See," Mrs. Jennings said. "Miss Margaret noticed, so surely you did as well." Marianne shook her head. "I am sorry, but I did not. I suppose it was a nice coat. I think I would have noticed if it were not." "You're a strange young woman," Mrs. Jennings said with a laugh. "She just might not wish to discuss such things," Eleanor interjected. "A modest girl," Sir John said with a wink. "I say, if we gents were not present, then you'd have your reply, madam." "No," Marianne cried. "I assure you that I took no particular notice of his coat." She glanced anxiously once again in the Colonel's direction. He was resolutely chasing a crumb around his plate. Was it because he did not wish to hear what she had to say, because he did not wish for her to be fond of Mr. Willoughby? Or did it just not matter to him as to what her answer would be? "His coat is the least of his expenses," the Colonel said, looking up from his plate. "But his other expenditures are not fit for polite conversation." Mrs. Jennings gasped. "Thank you," Marianne mouthed, as the topic of Mr. Willoughby's coat was dropped. The Colonel acknowledged her thanks with a tiny nod of his head and a half smile. He did care about her, at least enough to see that she was not further put upon by a subject that distressed her. However, her elation over such a thing was squelched, as Eleanor, who was seated beside the Colonel, leaned toward him and whispered something that caused him to smile completely, not merely in part. "Shall we go to the drawing-room?" Lady Middleton rose, and the other ladies followed suit. "How do you like our Colonel?" Mrs. Jennings asked Eleanor. "He would make an excellent husband." Marianne sucked in a breath. No, no, no. Mrs. Jennings could not be pushing Eleanor and the Colonel together. That would not do at all. "He seems pleasant," Eleanor said with a glance at Marianne. "However, I fear we might be too much alike." "Too alike? I never heard such a thing," Mrs. Jennings cried, as Marianne expelled the breath she had been holding, and Eleanor hid a small smile. "Sit with me, Miss Marianne. Now that the gentlemen are not with us, you can tell me what you think of Mr. Willoughby." "I could not," Marianne protested. "It is perfectly acceptable," Mrs. Jennings insisted. "Did you not find him handsome?" "Oh, he was handsome to be sure. I will freely admit that, but there seems to be something wanting, although I could not tell you what it is." It was true that she could not say what it was, but it was not true that she did not know what was missing about Mr. Willoughby. He was not the Colonel, and her heart had decided on the Colonel well before, nearly half a day before, meeting Mr. Willoughby, and she was not so fickle as to choose two gentlemen on the same day. Indeed, she was not certain she would pick Willoughby in any case. No, that might not be true. Her head tipped as she considered it. If she had met Mr. Willoughby before she had met Colonel Brandon, and had Mr. Willoughby spoken of Sir John being a bore, she might have liked him. Her brow furrowed. But did that mean that her heart was not to be trusted if it only took the time of day and subject of discussion to recommend one gentleman over another? Why would she have accepted Willoughby if things had been different? She rubbed her heart as it pinched at the thought of choosing Willoughby and never having chosen the Colonel. She did not mind the pinch, for it was a reassuring sort of pain which told her that, no matter the time of day or topic of discussion, her heart would eventually have found the Colonel. She looked up to see Mrs. Jennings watching her. "Have you deciphered what is wanting?" she asked. "You are in such deep contemplation that surely you must have." Marianne smiled and shook her head. "I really could not say what it is." "I think you and he would find much in common," Mrs. Jennings said. "Then they would not suit at all," Eleanor said, "for they would likely be far too much alike." "Too much alike? Again?" Eleanor nodded. "If Mr. Willoughby is as given to flights of fancy as my sister is, theirs would not be a very sensible marriage. Somewhat alike is good, too alike is to be avoided." "Our Colonel was given to passion when he was a young man, or so I have heard," Mrs. Jennings said to Eleanor in a persuasive tone. "He might be just enough unlike you for you to suit." Eleanor shook her head. "I am sorry, but I would prefer not to suit." "Prefer not to suit? Well, I've heard everything tonight. I shall have a time of it to see either of you married." "Not if it is the right gentleman," Eleanor assured her, a faint blush staining her cheeks. Marianne knew who the right gentleman was, but they had left him behind at Norland. "And only if it is the right time," she said, hoping that her eyes could convey part of the sorrow she felt on Eleanor's behalf. "The right time is any time after you're presented to society, and preferably before you're sat on the shelf. It is much harder to find a match the older you get," Mrs. Jennings cautioned. "I think we have a few years before we will be out of luck," Eleanor assured her. "I would not be too slow in coming to the point," Mrs. Jennings said. "I assure you that a young man can improve with age, Miss Marianne. Why? Our Colonel has become right serious, nearly too much so since returning to us. But then, that might be due to the love child. However, I must not speak of such things, for the gentlemen are here." The love child? Marianne closed her mouth, which had dropped open at Mrs. Jennings's words. Then it was true that the Colonel had a daughter? He must have been a very young man to have a daughter who was nearly the same age as she was. That must be why he would not speak of the lady he mentioned in the meadow this morning. "Miss Marianne, you must play for us." Sir John stood before her with his hand outstretched. Play for them? How could she play for them when her heart was in such a jumbled state? She could not marry the Colonel and be a mother to someone who was her own age. She just could not, and therefore her heart was likely to be forever broken. However, despite her jumbled brain and troubled heart, she placed her hand in Sir John's and allowed him to lead her to the instrument. "The Colonel will see to your pages," Sir John said with that same teasing wink that so often irritated her. This time it threatened to cause tears to fall. How could she play while he, who could never be hers, stood beside her, ready to assist with the moving of pages? "Are you well?" Colonel Brandon asked as she took her seat. She shrugged. "I'm uncertain if I wish to play or not. I thought you enjoyed music." "I do, but—" She looked back at Mrs. Jennings before setting aside the song she had hoped to convince the Colonel to sing with her, in favour of a piece that contained no lyrics. "What has happened?" he asked quietly as her fingers began to find their way along the instrument. She shook her head. "I cannot say. Not while I am playing, and perhaps not at all. There are a few things in my life about which I feel the same. It takes a great deal of fortitude to not think about them too often." He was watching her face. She could see it out of the corner of her eye. He was so attentive and so kind. Surely Mrs. Jennings could be wrong, could she not be? Marianne's heart had never wished so vigorously for someone to be incorrect. "One of those things is Eliza." Her fingers stumbled over the keys. "Is she—" He nodded. "The lady I mentioned this morning. I should like to speak to you of her." "Why?" He shook his head and sighed deeply. I do not know exactly. I've not spoken of her in years, but—" He shook his head again. "I do not know. I just do." "Then I will listen. We were star-crossed lovers. It is not a pretty tale." Marianne blew out a breath, willing her heart to stop its racing. "I'm certain I'm equal to it," she assured him. "Tomorrow morning?" he asked. She nodded. How she would survive until then she was uncertain. Curiosity was not always a friend. However, she did survive the night, and its copious amounts of tossing and turning, sometime in the midst of being unsettled and in an attempt to test her heart to see how much agony it could withstand. She had even imagined him telling her about his lost love and the daughter they shared. Therefore, as she climbed the path to the meadow, she was certain her heart was prepared for whatever he might tell her. That is, she was confident of her preparation to hear something dreadful until she saw him, and he turned toward her with a bright smile. Then, from the way her heart skipped, she feared she had not prepared it as well as she had hoped. Chapter 6. "Good morning," Colonel Brandon greeted Marianne as she approached him. "I left Lorcan at Barton Park. I hope you are not disappointed." "No, I'm not." The breeze pushed at her bonnet. His hat was already in his hand. It seemed she had been correct that he did not like to wear it overly much. "Thomas has accompanied me, however." He nodded toward where his horse stood with his groom and his groom's mount. "I did not wish for my beast to wander away." He extended an arm to her. She placed her hand on his arm where it felt it belonged. Oh, her heart was not going to survive this if it had to give him up. It was too far gone to be gently pried away. "The mist was heavy this morning. I feared I would not be allowed to walk out." Her mother had nearly denied her until she had begged most convincingly that flowers were needed on such a gloomy-looking morning. "I am glad it lifted some." "As am I," she agreed. "Shall I begin?" She nodded and steeled her heart. She wanted to look away from him. She did not want to see his pain or have him see hers, but she was no coward. Or at least, she was not for about a minute. Then she allowed her eyes to wander the path before them. He blew out a breath. "I'm uncertain how to begin. I've attempted to start this conversation many times during the night." "Then let me help you," Marianne said softly. "Who is Eliza?" "Eliza was my cousin who grew up with me. Her parents died when she was just an infant, and my father was her guardian. There was only a year difference in our age, so as you can well imagine we were great playfellows and friends. I cannot remember a time when I did not love Eliza. That love grew as we grew, and at one time I had purposed to take her for my wife. My father, however, had purposed to give her and her fortune to my brother, so that the estate would no longer languish." He shook his head and paused for a moment. "We had schemed to escape to Scotland, but we were discovered. I was sent away to stay with a distant relation, while Eliza was confined at home until my father's point had been gained, and she was married to my brother." Marianne sucked in a sharp breath. How horrid! To have lost his love to another would be tragic indeed, but to have always had to be reminded of that loss when he saw her with his brother must have been unbearable. "Was she eventually happy?" He shook his head. "My brother was unkind to her. He only accepted her for her money, and for a time she bore the situation, though unhappily. Eventually, however, she could withstand no more, and after seeking some form of love in the arms of someone who was not my brother, the marriage was put to an end." He ceased speaking, and they walked on for several minutes in silence. "I was in the East Indies when I heard of the dissolution of their marriage 2 years after it had happened. You have no way of knowing the grief and gloom that overtook me at the news. I had left, so that she might have some hope of finding happiness without my presence constantly reminding her of what could have been. Had I known, I never would have left." "You could not know," Marianne rushed to reassure him. "You did what you thought was right, and what should have been right. The sins of your father or brother, or even your dear Eliza, are not yours to bear." He smiled at her sadly. "I've told myself that many times." "Then you should listen to yourself, for it is sound advice." He covered the hand that lay on his arm with his free one. "So I should, but I fear I feel the weight of it all too greatly. I returned to England, but not before she'd fallen into desperate circumstances. I found her in a poorhouse, sick, and not at all as I remembered." He fell silent again, and Marianne, who could only imagine the agony he must be remembering, squeezed his arm reassuringly. "She was not long in living after my return, but I visited her as often as I could. He drew and released a breath. She had a daughter. The child was 3 when I found her mother. Oh! The word leapt from Marianne's mouth. The child is not yours? No, I do not know her father. Eliza would never name him. But you care for her? His brow furrowed. I do, but how do you know? Marianne looked down at the ground where they had stopped and now stood. Mr. Willoughby mentioned having met your daughter in Bath. Willoughby? Marianne nodded. Did he only meet her once? I could not say except that he spoke as if they had met often. Did he say if he had seen her recently? Marianne shook her head. Why? He turned away from her and looked up to the sky for a moment before turning back as he scrubbed his face with his hands. I've attempted to see to her care and education. I promised her dying mother that I would. I sent her to school, but eventually I removed her from there to place her with a very respectable woman. And all was well for a time, so I allowed her to go to Bath with one of her friends, who was also in this lady's care. It was a mistake, for she disappeared from there. I've not heard from or of her since. She is missing? Marianne's hand covered her rapidly beating heart at the shock of such a thing. He nodded. And her friend did not know where she was? She would not tell me, though I believe she knew all. How could she not tell you? Marianne cried. This is a dreadful business indeed. We must find her. Marianne flushed as he tipped his head to look at her curiously. I mean you, Marianne corrected. You must find her. I have attempted, and still I search, but all to no avail. He took her hand. His eyes searched hers. I know what the whispers are about my relationship to her. But they are untrue, Marianne said firmly. That will not make them go away. They matter not. I fear loving again. He dropped her hand and turned away from her. I failed my Eliza, and now I have failed her daughter. I can only imagine that she has eloped or fallen into the same destitute position as her mother. Does she love you, Eliza's daughter? What is her name? He shrugged. Her name is Eliza, after her mother. Does young Eliza love you? I thought she did. Marianne moved to stand next to him and placed her hand on his arm. Could she have done something about which she fears telling you? His eyes were on her hand where it lay on his arm. It is possible. Then it is even more imperative that we find her. She sucked in a breath and lifted her eyes to him. However I might be able to help you, you have only to ask. Why? Marianne looked out at the meadow before her, where the mist was lifting to reveal the freshness of the grass and flowers that lay beneath it. Because I cannot bear to see you in such pain any more than you can bear to speak of your Eliza's demise with equanimity. She looked at him and shrugged. I am young and likely foolish, or so Eleanor claims often. She smiled at his tentatively hopeful expression. And though I have no experience in these things aside from what I have read or been told, I believe I love you. She was sure her heart was about to climb up her throat and escape her body before she did something more, to send it racing even faster than it was at this moment. We have only just met, and I am an old man compared to you, he protested, even as he brushed a wayward tendril of hair from her cheek. You are not an old man, she returned with a shake of her head. Not to me. Again she shook her head. I do not understand it all myself, but my heart has chosen you. I wish to see you happy, to see you gathering flowers and to hear you singing, and I also wish to hold your hand and reassure you when life has dealt you an agonizing blow, such as this present loss of Eliza. I am not an easy man, he argued. I am not an easy lady, she countered. I am prone to fits of temper at times, and I do love the fanciful more often than Eleanor can tolerate. She took his hand in hers. I have no fortune, nor do I have a father. The only estate I have ever known was taken from me by a brother. I have not a lot to offer you besides my heart. I do not deserve such a precious gift. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it softly. I fear you will vanish with the mist that brought you to me. Never, she replied. He looked up to the clouds above them and drew a deep breath. The sun is shining. What a beautiful smile he had. It demanded she respond in kind while saying, it is, in agreement with him. It was certainly shining on his face. He lifted her hand to his heart and shook his head. Not just in the sky. Here. I had feared it never would until yesterday when I met you. And then I feared it was only a glimpse sent to torture me by reminding me of what I have lost. Marianne wondered if any lady had ever felt as treasured as she felt at that moment with him looking down at her. He cupped her cheek with his hand. "May I kiss you?" "You may," she said, but added as he gathered her into his embrace, "as long as you promise me that you will believe that only when the morning mist fails to appear, only then will I stop reminding you of my admiration for you." "It will take some time," he replied, "but I shall do my best to not doubt that you will be snatched from me." "Then you must kiss me." And he did, holding her to him, as if she were a precious jewel in need of protection, while his lips pressed against hers, tentatively at first, until Marianne sighed with pleasure. Then, as Marianne wound her fingers in his hair, he deepened the kiss, speaking to her without words about the amorous man who lay behind his composed facade, and declaring himself to be a gentleman who loved her as none other could. As the last tendrils of the morning mist raced away, followed by the playful pixies that caused a lady to shiver in the coolness of a fresh, new day, Marianne's heart found its home. It was not in an estate or a cottage, but in the love of a gallant gentleman who was as noble as any knight of old, and who would love her until his eyes would close, never to see the morning mist rise from a meadow again. Theirs would be a love that would surpass anything the Colonel had ever imagined possible, and of which Marianne had ever dreamt. For while they were not too alike in all things, for he was serious while she was fanciful, there was one trait which they shared, a passion that was incapable of loving by halves. This has been Morning Mist, a Nature's Fury and Delights novelette, written by Leanie Brown, narrated by Christopher, an authorised voice replica. The 2018 copyright for Morning Mist is held by Leanie Brown, all rights reserved.